Did you know that Sadako's jaw wobbles if you do the Mori with her ultra rare cosmetic? Or how the devs created the illusion of the Demogorgon eating the survivors' heads? Well, let's take a look at all the Memento Mories in the game from a completely new perspective. And let's start with the original trio, which have very basic Memento Mories by default, even in this new perspective. The only thing interesting about the original Memento Mories is how all of them use the same blood effect for their hits, which are just bubbles of dark liquid. And for the Trapper, these bubbles are very exaggerated, and they fly off the sides with each hit. All three of the Memento Mories also end with the killer standing on the side of the survivor and looking at the ground. For some reason, the Wraith is also one of the two only killers in the entire game where the survivors end up with their eyes closed after the Memento Mori, but in this case, it is done very poorly. For the rest of them, their eyes are open at all times, even in the one for the nurse, where a lot of people commented that her caressing the survivors at the end of it was closing their eyes. And talking about nurse, nothing special can be noted from a third-person perspective since the Mori itself already shows everything by default. But it's cool how the developers did pose the nurse to be on top of the survivors, even when her legs would not be visible at all from this perspective. The same can be said for Myers' Memento Mori, as it's very simple and there is nothing that his perspective unlocks. It is cool how you can see Myers' eyes from up close though. The Hag's Memento Mori was the very first that included something crazy, as the Hag starts eating the survivor. But as you might know, survivors' bodies cannot be altered, so what the devs did is spawn a bunch of chunk of meat which have an insanely low texture that has not been changed since 2016. The Doctor's Memento Mori is also very simple and the default camera already shows everything that needs to be shown. But it is cool how the Doctor puts his weapon in a holster before attacking the survivor. Leatherface has various cool things going on during his Mori. One thing that I personally never noticed is how you can actually see his eyes just like with Myers, which is something I didn't know before. Also, Leatherface is the only killer that throws his weapon on the ground when performing the Mori, and once finished, it teleports back to the killer's hand. This is also the second only Mori where the survivors end up with their eyes closed. The Mori of the Huntress is also very simple and there isn't much to talk about besides the axe not clipping correctly with the survivor's head, making it look weird. One thing that makes me sad about Freddy Krueger is that since he is so old, even if his face is exposed, he has no emotions whatsoever. So during his Mori he looks nonchalant and there is no smile despite there being laughs during it. I am sure that if he were to be released today, he would be smiling, or at least have some emotions. And finally, the Pig's Mori has the record of being the fastest and simplest Memento Mori in the game, as basically nothing happens during it. But instead of leaving you with a boring Mori, look at her face inside the pig mask, which is fully modeled. Now with the clown, we find the very first intelligent trick done by the developers in order to create something cool. In this case, as we know, the bodies of the survivors cannot be modified, but in this Memento Mori, the fingers of the survivors get cut and Clown sucks on them. Well, if you remember one of my last videos, I said that the developers bend the finger inside the survivor, and here you can see it happen. If we go inside the hand of the survivors, you can see the finger inside, and when you take a look at the finger Clown sucks on, it looks nothing like the survivors. In fact, it's the same for everyone, and exclusively made for this Memento Mori. The Spirit's Mori pisses me off because the survivors stand up immediately after you perform it, which makes no sense. But outside of that, I think the Mori is really good. The Legion's Mori is very well designed in terms of composition, and something that I think many players have not seen is how grave the stab on the feet is for survivors, because that single action already immobilizes them for sure. But another cool fact is how all Legion members have faces behind the mask, and the worst one for sure has to be Susie, because she is the only one that is actively smiling at all times. If you have emetophobia, skip to the next part, because this one is going to be nasty. There are two funny things about this Mori, with the first one being that in one part, the survivors become cross-eyed. The second funny thing I can show is that, due to the way these videos were recorded, the game world is paused, but the audios are not. This means that you are able to hear the entire sound of the plague vomiting, which sounds absolutely nasty. Here is a trick that the majority of game developers use in order to bring items into a specific animation, and that is spawning the items when they are required but before they are seen. So, in the case of Ghostface, where is the camera? The moment you begin performing the Mori, the camera spawns inside the body of Ghostface, and surprisingly, we can see that it is very well detailed, as you can check every button, and sadly no, you can see the image he took, but I can show you how canonically it would look like. So, how do the devs make it so that any head accessories from the survivors do not clip inside the mouth of the Demogorgon? Well, it can't clip in the first place if there are no accessories. So anytime a survivor's head is inside the mouth of the Demogorgon, their hats, glasses, and hair completely disappears, showing their baseball design. But how about a cosmetic which is a linked set? Sadly, those do clip because the solution the devs created was made before the existence of linked sets, showing their limitations. The Oni's Memento Mori will rip the tongue of the survivors out during it, but of course, since survivors' bodies cannot be modified, their tongue is still intact inside their mouth. The one that Oni holds is just an item created for this animation in specific. Dead Singer's Memento Mori is the best example of how ignoring realism can lead to a better result. Because as you can see here, the Memento Mori makes absolutely no anatomical sense since the spear should shoot through the survivor's chest instead of the mouth. Also, the Dead Singer's face animations are completely broken during the Memento Mori. One thing about Pyramid Head's Memento Mori that many people do not notice is how the metal beam completely bends the survivor's legs, which has to hurt a lot. Also, it's surprising to see how far down the beam as well as the wire cables go, which is avoided in later Moris in order to prevent issues when these animations are done in second stories of a map. The bubbles that appear in the Memento Mori of the Blight always looked low quality, and the close-up confirms this to me. The only brutal thing I could find is how deep inside the syringe goes for the survivors, and honestly, I would have loved if this was injected in their eyes. It's also cool to see how far away the syringe goes during the Mori. The Mori with twins without Victor is really basic, so there is nothing I can say about it. But I do find it interesting how the blood splatter effect that happens on the survivors appears before Victor pounces on the survivors themselves. Also, the survivor's expression is how I feel about twins. The Trickster, on the other hand, has a lot of cool mechanics on his Memento Mori. For example, the illusion on how the first blade he throws eventually lands on the survivors at the end. Well, for obvious reasons, the developers didn't animate a knife going very far in the sky and landing down. Instead, the knife disappears, only to later reappear on top of the survivors and falling down. This is something that can be seen in third person too, which is funny. Additionally, here is a closer look at the autograph, which is a unique asset made for this animation in specific. Something awesome that is exclusive to the Nemesis Memento Mori is how after kicking the survivors on the ground for a final time, the impact is so heavy that it shatters the ground, showing how strong the Nemesis physically is. It's also cool to see all the tentacles hidden inside his wrist, ready to leave when he uses them. The Cenobite has a very unique feature about his Mori, and that is the fact that only Plague, Cenobite, and Wesker move their mouths when they speak. This is because in Dead by Daylight, the devs did not add mouth animations for dialogue, so they have to manually animate them, and since Cenobite says the exact same thing every time, they could give the illusion that he is speaking. The Chatterer does not speak in the Mori, but since the Mori is exactly the same, he is still animated as if he was speaking, making him look funny. Also, you can see how the pole disappears under the ground along with the survivor in order to prevent other players from seeing how they appear in case this is done in a two-story building. And this is the start of this technique used by the devs in order to prevent these features from happening. The artist has one of the cooler Memento Moris in the game, and honestly the default camera work is absolutely fantastic already. but I thought it would be cool to see how the devs, for example, created these low poly crows that would fly all around the artist after she performs her Mori, or how unhinged she appears in the Mori, which by the way is the best moment to see how her tongue is cut, because that was one of the body parts she lost before being taken by the entity. Check this out. This is how Sadako looks like during the Mori and how the eye effect is done. But also something interesting about this Mori is how the survivor's bones snap during it, but the bone effect itself is very low poly and basic. But let's take a look at Sadako's face in every single Mori, and as you can see, her entire face is fully modeled under the hairs, and it is actually really well made. Perhaps the craziest face is the one from her DVD mobile cosmetic, by far one of the most gruesome cosmetics in the entire game. And finally, if you remember from the intro, yes, her jaw wobbles while performing this Memento Mori, and I have no idea why this is the case. Starting strong with the dredge, did you know that the effect that appears when performing the Memento Mori is just a layer that spawns on the camera so it looks like nightfall? This is how the rest of survivors don't see the map darken while performing the Mori, and you can see how huge these black layers are. Another interesting thing is where does the killer take the survivors? And all they did is basically moving them under the ground inside the fog of the dredge in order to make them disappear just like in the Cenobite's Mori. Also, you can see just how much damage the tools did to the survivors. Did you ever notice how high the survivors go when Wesker kills them with the Ouroboros? Or how insane the Ouroboros damage is to the survivors? I personally never did, and seeing it from this perspective is really cool. There is also another thing I want to congratulate the devs on, and that's how the artist intentionally cut the Ouroboros bottom part in order to prevent it from cutting on the ground just like the Cenobite. The Knight has one of the most complex Moris in the game due to the many factors it contains as well as all the guards that spawn on the animation. And something I personally never noticed is how the jailer is the very first guard to despawn when the Mori is being performed, whereas the other guards still keep going, which I don't get why. The jailer's firebrand also has a skeleton face on it, which is a fantastic detail too. In my opinion, this is one of the best animated Memento Moris in the entire game. I could not find any flaw with it. And well, we go from one of the best to the worst in the game. Even this new perspective won't save how bad this Mori looks like. The Singularity has one of the most groundbreaking Memento Moris in the game since the hack, as it's absolutely gruesome and the effects done to create it are very smart. For starters, during this Memento Mori, the developers spawned the syringe module on the Singularity's head, which sadly looks like the future cosmetics are not designed with this in mind, as it clips in the TV head cosmetic. And the second cool part of the Mori is how the effect of the melted face is created. So, as you already know, survivors' bodies cannot be modified. Well, in order to create the melted face effect, the devs add an effect on the faces of the survivors which hides all their features like any masks, glasses and their face that is included on it. This is the same effect used in order to hide the collision of the map when Memento Moris are activated. And then, they spawn the melted face inside the survivor's head. This means that the melted face is indeed the same for all survivors. So for example, for Alucard, who is a vampire, there are no fang teeth on it. And also, the melted face is smaller than the survivor's head, but due to the camera location, it looks perfectly fine. I love details like this, which show how the devs bypass the heavy limitation this game has. This same technology used in order to create the melted face is used again in order to create the gaping hole that the xenomorph causes on the survivor's head, and to me it shows that during this period of time, they were already working on the finisher Mori mechanic. I always wondered what is going on with Chucky at the start, and turns out he throws the hammer so hard that his head goes back on his own body, which is fun in my opinion. Also, in order to create that cartoony effect of having tools spawned on his body, all the devs did is place them under the ground in order to teleport them to Chucky's hand, and this means that in theory, if you perform this Mori on the second floor of the game, you should be able to see these tools floating in the air. I have no clue why the expressions of the survivors during the Unknown's Memento Mori look so exaggerated and cartoony. It also shows how the survivors are sucked inside the Unknown, which is already supernatural compared to other killers. And for some reason, the UVX spawns while the survivors are being sucked. Pause. Vecna's Memento Mori is extremely cool as it also has a lot of cool components on it. And let's start with how the skeleton effect is done, as the solution in order to create such an insane Mori was to make the bodies disappear with the same tech used for Singularity and Xenomorph, and spawn a skeleton on that spot, which is once again the exact same for all survivors, so Alucard once again loses his fangs. The positioning of all the skeletons is also really well made, and honestly overall, this might be one of my favorite Memento Moris in the game. Remember how I said all Memento Moris that have external tools spawn them before they appear in scene? Well, for Dracula, his wine glass is spawned under the ground before it gets teleported to his hands, so once again it is possible that you could find it under the ground in 2-story buildings. Aside from that, it is really cool how well detailed the bats are, especially when compared to the crows from the artist. But of course this makes sense, as the bats do appear during the bat form. As you may also know, the Houndmaster will step on your face so much that it makes a mess on your head. But the funny part is that this mangled mess is not made in the same way as the Singularity was. Instead, what the devs did is spawn this on top of the survivor's head, clipping it inside. And you can see how it's a combination of meat, bones, and even one eye. Possibly one of the most brutal images in Dead by Daylight as a whole. Also, here is how it looks like if you were moried by her. The Ghoul's Memento Mori is already pretty visible with the default camera visuals, so there is nothing much that can be talked about. Springtrap's Memento Mori is also pretty well shown overall by default, as everything that needs to be shown is indeed shown. I do find it weird how the eyes of the survivors are extremely exaggerated while the Mori is being performed. Besides that, it's cool how much the killers bend in order to jump scare the survivor on the ground in order to give that cool final shot, and how their faces are full of splatters from the Blendo skeleton. Talking about it, this animatronic is very well detailed, but it makes sense as this machine already exists inside the pizzeria map. And now let's talk about the legendary cosmetics, as there are 3, starting with Naughty, which doesn't have anything very interesting besides the faces that survivors have once the Memento Mori is over, which is honestly pretty fitting for having your head be stuck in a bear trap. The Were Elk Mori, as I showed on my tier list, is kinda basic, except for the end where we can see body parts of the survivors stuck in the antlers. These are very well detailed, especially when compared to the ones from like Hack, which were just bits of meat. And finally, we have the coolest Mori in the game, True Lord Dracula, and I find it very funny how during the animation, he is screaming at the butt of the survivors instead of their faces, but since the camera work is so well done, it doesn't look like it. Also, you probably know that the spine of the survivors are ripped at the end of the Mori, but what I didn't know is that unlike the other meats, this one spawns already inside the ground to be teleported to his hand at the end. And that's all the Memento Moris currently in the game. If you found this video cool and learned something new, let me know in the comments and also leave a like. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.